My son Dale was 9 years old the morning he walked back from the well with something following him. I was standing at the kitchen window washing out my coffee cup when I saw him come through the tree line at the edge of our property. He was moving slow, the way boys move when they're trying not to spook an animal, with his arms pressed flat against his sides and his head turned just enough to watch the thing behind him without fully facing it. And the thing behind him was real. It was not a calf that had gotten loose, not a dog from one of the neighboring farms, not any animal I had a name for in that first blinding second when I saw its shape emerge from between the pines. It was small, smaller than what most people imagine when they hear the word, but it walked upright and it moved with a deliberate, swinging confidence that no animal on four legs could fake. And when Dale stopped at the edge of the yard and turned around and held out his hand the way he would to any animal he was trying not to startle, the thing stopped too and looked at his hand and made a sound that I could hear through the kitchen glass. A low, clicking trill like something between a wood thrush call and the deep chest hum of a hound dog. My coffee cup hit the bottom of the sink. I was already moving toward the door. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had an encounter like this. My name is Dorothy Price. I'm 67 years old and I have lived on this farm in Pocahontas County, West Virginia for 41 of those years. The farm belonged to my husband's family before it was ours. 112 acres on the eastern slope of Droop Mountain, bordered on the north by Cranberry Creek and on the west by a mixed hardwood forest that runs without interruption into the Monongahela National Forest. We grow hay and sweet corn. We keep a small beef cattle operation, 15 head most years. My husband Eugene raised his kids here. I raised my kids here, and we have buried 2 dogs and 1 horse in the back field and fully expect to be buried there ourselves eventually. I tell you all of that because I need you to understand what kind of people we are. Eugene spent 22 years working at the paper mill in Marlinton before it scaled back, and after that he did carpentry work and odd jobs around the county. I worked part-time at the Pocahontas County Library in Marlinton for 17 years. We went to the same Methodist church that Eugene's parents had attended. We paid our taxes. We drove trucks with over 200,000 miles on them because you don't replace something that still runs. We were not and are not people who see things that aren't there. We are the exact opposite of that kind of people. Eugene passed in 2015. Cancer, the quiet, fast-moving kind that takes a man before his family has time to prepare. Our daughter, Carol, lives in Lewisburg now with her husband and 2 boys. Our son, Dale, the same Dale who walked back from the well that morning, is 34 years old and lives about 6 miles from the farm on a piece of property he bought after he got out of the Army. He manages a landscaping crew in Greenbrier County. He is a large, quiet, steady man, and he has told me on more than one occasion that what happened when he was 9 years old is the thing he thinks about more than anything else from his childhood, more than anything else from his life. I have never spoken about it publicly. The 3 people I told over the years, and my sister Ruth in Tulick, Pennsylvania, Eugene's brother Harold and Carol, who found out accidentally when she was in her 20s, all responded the same way, politely disbelieving. The kind of disbelief that's wrapped in concern for the person doing the telling. I stopped telling people. I kept it. I carried it the way you carry a stone in your pocket. Always there, always heavy, so familiar after a while that you stop noticing the weight until one day you take it out and look at it in full light and realize how singular it is. That day is now. The summer of 1991 was a dry one in Pocahontas County. We'd had a wet spring which brought the corn up strong, but by the end of June the rain had dropped off and the creek ran lower than I'd seen it in years. Eugene had gone to Lewisburg that Tuesday morning to pick up a part for the tractor, and I had sent Dale to pull water from the hand pump well at the north edge of our property near the tree line. We used that well for the kitchen garden, groundwater from the old sandstone aquifer that ran under the hillside, sweet and cold even in August. Dale had made that walk 100 times. It was maybe 300 yards from the back porch to the well through open pasture, and then another 50 yards of scrub brush before you hit the first real trees. He was gone longer than usual. I didn't think much of it at first, and Dale was the kind of boy who stopped to watch a beetle or a water strider or a hawk making lazy circles overhead. He had a naturalist's patience that I always suspected came from spending too much time with Eugene's old wildlife books. But when 25 minutes turned into 40, I started watching out the kitchen window, and that is when I saw him come out of the trees. I got out the back door fast, but not running because running spooks things, and I already understood on some level that whatever was behind my son required very careful handling. I walked to the edge of the porch and stopped. The thing had paused when the screen door opened. It stood maybe 12 feet behind Dale, who turned to look at me and then back at it, and in that turning, I could see that his face was not afraid. He was excited. The way he got excited when he found an arrowhead in the creek bed or a box turtle under the orchard grass. The pure, clean excitement of a child who has found something wonderful, the thing itself. I will describe it exactly as I saw it, and I will not make it bigger or more dramatic than it was, because the truth is strange enough. It stood roughly 4 feet tall, 4 feet, possibly 4'1", with a build that was not a child's build, not the thin-limbed fragility of a 9-year-old, the same height. It was compact in the way that a bear cub is compact, with mass distributed low and wide, through the haunches and across the shoulders. Its body was covered in hair, coarse and dense and dark, more like the thick winter coat of a deer than anything domestic, and it was hair, not the short, bristly pelt you see on livestock, but long guard hair growing close to the skin, the color of old hickory bark, almost black in the shade of the tree line, but showing a warm, dark brown where the morning light caught it along its back. It stood upright, not crouching, not resting its weight forward on its knuckles, not perched on the balls of its feet the way a person crouches, upright and still with its arms hanging loose at its sides, its weight settled square over both feet. It was watching me, its face. The face was the thing that stopped me from calling Dale back inside, because the face was not an animal's face. The nose was broad and flat, and the brow was heavy, and the features were coarser than a human child's features in ways that I can't entirely reduce to language. But the eyes were light. They were amber, closer to gold than brown, and they moved across my face with an attention that I have only seen in a living being that is thinking. Not reacting, thinking. It was assessing me the same way I was assessing it, and the recognition of that process, that mutual assessment, was what made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Dale said very quietly, "Mom, it's been following me since the well." I said, "I know, baby, stand still." Neither of us moved for what felt like a long time. The thing eventually looked away from me, down at Dale's outstretched hand, and then back up at my face. It made the sound again, the clicking trill, lower this time, sustained for maybe 4 seconds. And then it turned, not fled, not startled, just turned with deliberate ease and walked back into the trees, not running. Walking, the way you walk when you leave a place you've already decided you'll return to. I got Dale inside. I sat him down at the kitchen table and I gave him a glass of water, and I asked him very carefully to tell me exactly what had happened at the well. He said he'd pumped the bucket full and then heard a sound in the scrub brush behind the well housing. A rustling, and then a silence, and then the sound again, closer. He said he thought it was a groundhog at first, but groundhogs don't make that particular kind of rustling, which is low and deliberate instead of quick and nervous. He stood still and waited, the way Eugene had taught him to wait when you want to see something without scaring it off. He said after about 2 minutes it came out of the brush. He said it was small and it looked at him for a moment and then went back partway into the brush and then came back out, back and forth twice, until he understood that it wanted him to follow. He said he didn't follow it. He had enough sense for that, but he also didn't leave right away because he didn't want to startle it. He stood there with his bucket and watched it, and after a while, it seemed to lose interest in trying to lead him and just looked at him with the calm of a being that had already decided he posed no threat, and it sat down on its haunches in the grass a few feet away. He said they stayed like that for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, just looking at each other. Then he picked up his bucket and started walking home, and it followed him. "Did it make any sounds at the well?" I asked. "At first it made that clicking sound," he said, "but when it sat down, it made a different sound, quieter, like humming almost, in your chest, not your throat." "Were you scared?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "not once. I could see it good. It smelled weird, though." "Weird how?" He scrunched up his face, trying to put it into words. "Like the creek after it rains, dirt and something warm, like when you walk into the barn in winter." I knew the smell he meant. I had caught the edge of it myself as the thing stood in the yard. musky and organic and mineral, like upturned earth and warm animal musk laid over it. Not bad, just dense and entirely unlike anything I had cataloged from 30 years of living alongside every living thing in these mountains. Eugene came home around noon. I told him what happened over lunch, with Dale at the table filling in the parts I hadn't seen. Eugene listened the same way he listened to everything, with his arms folded on the table and his eyes steady and his face not showing much. When we finished, he asked Dale 2 questions. He asked if it had tried to touch him or come between him and the house, and Dale said no. He asked if it had made any aggressive movement, any charge or bluff or raised up display, and Dale said no. Then Eugene nodded and said, "All right," which was his way of saying he was taking the thing seriously, not dismissing it and not panicking about it, taking it seriously. That afternoon, Eugene walked the property line along the north edge, where the pasture met the scrub brush and the tree line began. He came back an hour later with dirt on his knees and a look on his face that I recognized from the few times in our marriage when he had genuinely been caught off guard. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, "There are tracks." He had found 4 clear prints in the soft earth near the well and 2 more in the mud along the edge of the creek where the scrub brush opened up. He had measured them with a piece of twine he carried in his pocket, a habit from his carpentry work. Each print was approximately 11 inches long and 6 inches across at the widest point, which is the ball of the foot. The toe impressions were clear in 3 of the 4 prints, with a spread that suggested a wide, flexible foot. The stride measured about 32 inches between prints, which he said was short for the print size. Short strides relative to foot size indicate either a young animal, a cautious movement, or both. He said the depth of the impression in the soft earth near the creek compared against the impression his own boot made in the same spot suggested the animal weighed somewhere between 90 and 120 pounds. He didn't say animal as a dismissal. He said it as a neutral description, the way you use the word for something you don't yet have a better word for. That night I thought about whom to call. I ran through the options the way you do when something happens that doesn't fit inside the normal channels. The sheriff's office, the Division of Natural Resources office in Elkins, which was responsible for wildlife in the Monongahela, the extension office at West Virginia University in Morgantown. I didn't call any of them because every version of the conversation I rehearsed ended the same way, with me sounding unstable and then making notes in a file and sending someone out to do a wellness check rather than a wildlife investigation. Eugene agreed. Whatever this was, we were not ready to hand it to anyone else. Not yet. What I'm going to tell you next covers a period of about 3 years from the summer of 1991 to the fall of 1994. 3 years in which a presence, more than one as it turned out, came and went at the edges of our property with a regularity that became, after the initial shock had worn down, almost a kind of rhythm. A seasonal rhythm like the deer migrations and the bear movements and the turkey flocks that crossed the property every October. Except this was different because this was not random movement. This was purposeful proximity. They came toward us. They stayed near, and the more we sat with that fact, Eugene and I, over coffee in the early mornings and at the kitchen table after Dale and Carol had gone to bed, the more it seemed like the right word for what was happening was not intrusion. It was attention.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The second sighting happened in late August of that same year, 1991, about 5 weeks after the morning at the well. This time it wasn't the small one. Eugene was up before dawn, the way he always was in summer when the hay needed turning before the heat set in. He went out to the equipment shed at around 5:15 and was coming back across the yard toward the house when he stopped. He was 30 feet from the back porch. What he saw was standing at the far tree line, partially behind the trunk of a large tulip poplar, watching the house. He told me about it at breakfast. After he'd had time to sit with it, he said it was large. Not the 4-foot compact shape that Dale and I had seen, but genuinely large, the way you understand large when you're standing in an open field in the gray pre-dawn light, and the thing on the far edge of that field is too big to be any animal you know, and it is on 2 legs and it is watching you. He estimated 7 to 8 feet, which he said felt conservative, given the way it compared to the tree trunk beside it. The hair was the same dark color we'd seen on the small one, though. He said the body was broader, heavier, with shoulders that he described as a door frame standing on legs. He couldn't see the face clearly in the low light. He said he stood there, and it stood there for perhaps a minute. Then he raised one hand, palm out, not aggressive, just present, and the large shape moved back behind the tree and was gone, not fleeing, withdrawing the way you withdraw when you've seen what you came to see. He came inside and poured his coffee and sat down, and he said, "Dot, I think the one that followed Dale was somebody's child. I had been thinking the same thing since the first morning. The way the small one had looked back and forth between Dale and me, the way it had turned and walked back into the trees without any alarm or scurry, the confidence of it. You don't move that way unless you have been taught that you are safe, and the teaching of that confidence falls to a parent. Now, there was a parent, possibly checking on where the child had gone, possibly deciding whether the humans it had been watching were safe enough to be around its young, possibly both. Over the next weeks, Eugene and I made quiet changes to how we moved around the property. We stopped shouting across the yard to each other. We moved more slowly along the north pasture fence line. We didn't change the farm routine. The cattle still needed tending. The garden still needed weeding. Dale and Carol still ran the property with the freedom of children who'd grown up on it. But we moved through those routines with a consciousness we hadn't carried before, an awareness that we might be observed and that how we conducted ourselves was being noted. I started leaving things at the well. Not as a strategy, not because I'd read about gift exchanges anywhere or had any framework for what I was doing. It was instinct. The same instinct that makes you set out a dish of water for a stray cat. The first time, I left a handful of sweet corn from the garden, shucked and broken into pieces. The next morning it was gone, but I couldn't be certain it wasn't a raccoon. The second time, I left a larger amount and scattered some wood ash around the well housing, the way you check for tracks. The corn was gone in the morning. The ash showed disturbance, not raccoon paw prints, not the scuffle marks of a deer, but the compressed, flat impression of a wide foot, toes forward, partial arc of a heel. Eugene watched me do this with the particular patience he reserved for things he didn't fully understand, but recognized as necessary. He never told me to stop. He never made it strange. He just occasionally walked with me to the well in the evening when the light was going gold, and we'd leave whatever I'd brought and walk back in the dusk without talking. And there was something about those walks that I have held on to for over 30 years now. The two of us walking slowly across a pasture we'd known for decades, carrying sweet corn or dried apple rings or a piece of smoked venison, bringing something to the edge of a world we didn't have the words for. September brought the first hard nights. By mid-month, the temperature was dropping into the 40s after dark, and the sounds from the north tree line changed, not threatening sounds. The same clickings and deep register hums that Dale had described at the well, but more frequent, and sometimes accompanied by what I can only describe as wood percussion, the heavy, measured knock of a hard object against a tree trunk. 3 beats, then silence, then 3 beats again. The sound carried across the pasture clearly on cold nights. I heard it so many times over the following years that it eventually stopped registering as strange and became simply part of the night's vocabulary, like the screech owls that worked the orchard. In October, Dale had his 10th birthday. We had a small party on the Saturday afternoon. Carol's best friend and 2 boys from Dale's class at Hillsborough Elementary. After the kids went home and Carol was in her room and the dishes were done, Dale came to sit with me in the kitchen, which he did when he had a matter to raise that he was working up to. He sat across from me with his hands flat on the table, and he said he'd seen it again, the small one. 3 days earlier, after school, in the scrub brush behind the barn, he said it had been watching him throw a baseball against the barn wall, and when he noticed it and stopped, it had done something he couldn't explain. It had crouched down and then stood back up very slowly and then crouched again. He said it looked like it was showing him something, like it was demonstrating a position. "Did you try doing it?" I asked. He said yes. He'd crouched down and stood back up, and the small one had made the chest hum sound and done it again. He said they went back and forth maybe 5 or 6 times before he heard Eugene's truck coming up the road, and he went inside. I asked him if he told his father. He said, "Not yet." He said he didn't know how to explain the part about the crouching without it sounding like he was saying they were playing together, and he wasn't sure if that was what was actually happening or if he was imagining it. I said, I think that's probably what was happening. He looked at me for a while with those steady brown eyes that he'd gotten from Eugene's side of the family. Then he said, is it a baby? Like, is its mom the big one Dad saw? I think so, I said, or its mother or its father, one of them. Then why does it follow me? I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't have a complete one. The best I have arrived at over 30 years of thinking about it is this, that the small one had seen Dale at the well and assessed him as interesting and non-threatening in the way that children across many species assess things. Young beings are curious by design. Curiosity is survival. You have to learn what the world contains before you can navigate it safely. Dale was 9 years old and slow-moving and gentle-faced, and the small one was whatever age it was and also curious and also, apparently, drawn to another young being that was neither predator nor prey, but something else entirely. Eugene and I talked for a long time that winter about what, practically, we were supposed to do. The farm was ours. The forest behind it was national forest land, public property that butted up against our property line. What was using that forest was not, as far as either of us could determine, any animal recognized by the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources or any federal wildlife agency. We had no legal framework, no regulatory category, no reporting mechanism that applied. We also had no desire to report. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes hear this kind of story and wonder why the family didn't immediately call someone with authority. I'll tell you exactly why. Because every version of that phone call led to the same place. Men with tranquilizer guns and wildlife cameras and graduate students and eventually news trucks at the end of our road. And what those things would do to a family of beings that had been living quietly at the edge of our forest was not something I was willing to be responsible for. I was not going to be the person who called, whatever the phrase is in wildlife management, for the capture of something that had gone out of its way not to harm us. That was not a choice I was willing to make, so we didn't make it. We made other choices instead. We fenced in the vegetable garden more securely, not to keep anything out, but to keep the cattle from trampling it, which they'd always been inclined to do when the fence got loose. We fixed the gate on the chicken coop. We made sure there was nothing lying around the outbuildings that could be dangerous, no loose baling wire, no open containers of motor oil, no tools left on the ground where a foot could land on them wrong in the dark. These were not grand gestures. They were the gestures of people trying to be decent neighbors to someone they couldn't introduce themselves to. The winter of 91 into 92 was cold and heavy with snow, the way West Virginia winters can be when they mean business. The pasture went white in December and stayed white until March, and the creek froze along its edges, though not across its center. The sounds from the tree line went quieter in January and February, not absent, but reduced. I found tracks in the snow occasionally near the well and along the north fence. The stride was longer in the snow than it had been in the soft summer earth, which Eugene said made sense. You stretch your stride in snow to reduce the number of times you have to lift your foot through the crust. The prints were preserved beautifully, sometimes for days before the wind scoured them. 11 inches, 6 inches across, deep enough to suggest substantial weight. By spring of 92, Eugene and I had settled into something I can only call adjusted normalcy. We knew what was out there. We didn't talk about it constantly, because constant talk would have made it strange again, and we needed it to be ordinary enough to live alongside. We went about our farming and our work and our children with the same regularity, and the things in the forest went about whatever their version of that was, and we passed at the edges of each other's lives with a care that felt, in its way, almost domestic. I want to try to describe what that adjusted normalcy actually felt like to live inside, because I think it is the part of this that gets lost when you try to reduce it to the facts of what happened. The facts are interesting. The living of it was something else. Every morning I got up and made coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the north tree line, the same tree line I had looked at for 18 years before the summer of 91, the same cottonwood and tulip poplar and the big stand of red oak that Eugene's father had refused to sell when the timber companies came through in the 60s. The same view every morning. Except now I was looking at it differently, not anxiously, not with fear or even with expectation, just with an awareness that the view contained more than it appeared to contain, that there was depth behind it, a depth that moved and breathed and made decisions. It changed the quality of the looking without changing anything about what I could see. Eugene felt it too, I know, though we rarely spoke about it directly. We'd developed a language of indirection around the whole thing, the way married people sometimes develop codes for subjects they've decided to carry lightly. A look across the dinner table when we heard the wood knocking start up after dark. A particular way he had of setting his coffee cup down when he came in from the early morning chores that told me he'd noticed something at the tree line. The language existed because naming it too often, would have given it a shape that felt wrong. It wasn't a crisis, it wasn't a threat, it was simply a feature of our lives, and like most features of a life, it resided better in the peripheral vision than in the direct gaze. There were practical dimensions to this that I'd never have anticipated. I found myself noticing things about the woods I'd walked alongside for nearly 2 decades. The white-tailed deer that had always bedded in the hemlock stand at the creek's bend no longer used that stand. By June of '92, they'd shifted their bedding ground south toward the property's far corner, as far from the north tree line as the terrain allowed. I watched a flock of turkey hens that had reliably scratched in the scrub along the fence line every October simply stop appearing. Not the whole flock, just the hens who used the north range. The flock redistributed without any apparent disruption, the way water redistributes around an obstacle. Something at the north edge had changed the territory's equation, and the animals with local knowledge had adjusted accordingly, quietly and without drama. Eugene noticed the changes in the deer population before I did. He came in one November evening and said the big doe that had been using the hemlock stand for 3 seasons straight wasn't there anymore and hadn't been for 2 months. He said it not as a complaint but as an observation, the tone he used when he was logging a fact for later consideration. I said I'd noticed the turkeys too. We looked at each other across the kitchen and understood, without saying it directly, that the redistribution of wildlife in our immediate area was a form of evidence, an indicator of a presence that the animals with their finer instruments could read more clearly than we could. Carol did not see any of this. Carol came home from school and did her homework and helped with dinner and talked on the phone with her friends and was thoroughly, completely 14 years old in the fall of '92, absorbed in a world whose center of gravity was several miles away in the social architecture of Hillsborough High School. She was not unobservant. Carol had always been sharp, quicker with people than Dale was, faster at reading rooms and currents, but she was pointed at a different set of signals. The north tree line was backdrop. It had always been backdrop, and nothing in her life at that moment required her to look at it any differently. I was glad of this. I was glad she was absorbed in her own life, and I was glad she moved quickly and loudly, and that the small one had apparently made a considered judgment about her that resulted in her remaining, at least for that first year, outside the circle of contact. One child who carries a secret of this weight is enough for any family. Dale's interactions with the small one continued through that spring and summer. They were always brief and always initiated by the small one appearing at the edge of whatever Dale was doing. And they always ended with the small one departing before Eugene or I came too close. Carol didn't see it that first year, which I think was partly because she was 13 and absorbed in the social world of Hillsborough Middle School, and partly because she moved faster and louder than Dale did. The small one had apparently developed its own assessment of who on our property was safe company. In June of '92, something happened that shifted the quality of what was going on. I was cutting hay in the lower field with the old John Deere, the early morning before the heat could build, and I'd come around the far corner of the field and stopped to check the cutter bar for a rock that had rattled through. I climbed down and was crouched beside the machine when I heard from the hedgerow at the field's edge the clicking trill, clear and close. I stood up and turned around. Both of them were at the hedgerow. The small one and the large one, side by side, standing at the edge of the elderberry and blackberry tangle that separated the lower field from the slope leading up toward the national forest. The large one I was seeing clearly for the first time in daylight, in full morning light at a distance of maybe 60 feet with nothing obscuring the view. It was immense, 7.5 feet at minimum, and broad across the chest and shoulders in a way that made the word broad seem insufficient. Its body hair was darker than the small one's, nearly black at the shoulders and thinning slightly to a dark walnut brown at the face, which was turned toward me with a directness that was not threatening. The face itself. The face is the part I have come back to in my memory more times than I can count over 30 years. The nose was large and flat, the brow ridge heavy and prominent, the jaw wide. Not a human face, but the eyes were set in it with an expression that had no analog in any animal I knew. Not curious in the darting, alert way of deer or foxes. Steady, considered. A gaze that was placing you in context, understanding what you are in relation to what it is and what it needs from the moment. The small one glanced at the large one and then back at me and made a soft version of the chest hum. The large one did not move. It watched me for perhaps 20 seconds. Then, with a slow deliberateness that felt like a choice being finalized, it placed one hand on the small one's shoulder and turned it gently away from the field, and they walked back up the slope together into the brush. The large one paused once just before the brush closed around them and looked back at me. Then they were gone. I sat down in the grass at the field's edge because my legs had decided they'd had enough of holding me up. I sat there in the hay smell and the June heat, and I thought about what I had just seen. The large one's hand on the small one's shoulder, the small one being turned and walked home, and the only word my mind kept returning to was mother. Not because it looked like a human mother, because the gesture was exactly that gesture. The particular specific gesture of a mother deciding her child has been somewhere long enough. I drove the John Deere back to the barn and went inside and told Eugene. He listened, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said something that has stuck with me since. He said, "She's been watching all of it from the beginning. She's been watching and deciding whether we're the kind of people who are safe to be around her young." He wasn't wrong. Looking back at the full arc of it, the small one following Dale, the large one appearing at the tree line at dawn, the measured, incremental way the presence made itself known, it had never been random. It had always been calibrated, closer when nothing went wrong, staying when nothing alarmed. It was the most careful, methodical trust-building I had ever witnessed, and it had been conducted entirely on their terms, at their pace, without any urgency or desperation. The patience of it was almost staggering. 1992, moved into 93, and the farm continued, and Eugene fixed the tractor, and Carol started high school in Lewisburg, and Dale played Little League, and I worked my library shifts in Marlinton, and at the edges of all of it, the family in the forest lived their seasons, because by then I had come to think of them as a family. The large one, the mother, I was certain of it now, and the small one. I did not know if there were others in the deeper forest, others beyond our property's border. I suspected so, but I had no evidence, and I didn't go looking for it. That wasn't my mountain to search. The small one's visits to Dale became more regular through the summers and less cautious. By the summer of 93, when Dale was 11, there were sessions in the back pasture that lasted 20 to 30 minutes, always at dusk, always initiated by the small one appearing at the fence line and waiting. Dale would go out. He knew by now not to move quickly or make noise. And they would be near each other in the way that animals of different species sometimes are when they've decided the other is not a threat. The small one would do things, and sometimes Dale would do the same things back, and sometimes it would do what Dale was doing, throwing rocks at a stump, pulling up handfuls of grass and dropping them, sitting still and watching the bats come out over the upper pasture at dusk. I watched these sessions from the back porch, from what I hoped was a distance that seemed respectful. The small one knew I was there. It glanced at me periodically with those amber eyes. It never retreated. I took this as the measure of how far we'd come, that my presence 60 feet away on the back porch was now just a feature of the landscape, part of the farm, accounted for. Not alarming. Dale asked me once, midsummer of 93, if he thought the small one knew he was a boy. Knew he was a child specifically. I thought about it and said I did think so, yes. I said I thought it recognized something in him that it didn't see in Eugene or me, some quality of being young and still forming that it understood from the inside. Dale chewed on this for a while and then said, "Do you think it has other kids around like brothers and sisters?" I said I didn't know. He said, "I hope it does. I hope it doesn't have to do this by itself." This, meaning whatever it was doing on our fence line, reaching across a distance that should have been uncrossable, seeking what it apparently needed from the only source within reach. The fall of '93 brought a change that I had not anticipated, and that altered everything for the next year. In late October, Eugene went out to check the cattle at dusk and came back with a look on his face that was different from any look I'd seen before. He sat down at the kitchen table and said that something had happened at the north pasture gate that he wanted to tell me about calmly. He had been latching the gate after moving the cattle back to the near pasture when he heard movement behind him. He turned slowly the way we'd all learned to turn on our own property. The small one was standing about 15 feet away, which was the closest it had ever come to either of us without Dale present, and it was holding something out toward him, not dropping it, not leaving it on the ground. Holding it out in both hands, extended toward Eugene, the posture unmistakable as an offering. It was a piece of flat stone, gray-brown Mississippian limestone from the looks of it, roughly the size of Eugene's palm and worked along one edge into a rough curved scraper. Not a crude break, a deliberate shaping. Eugene said he could see the percussion marks along the flaked edge where a harder stone had struck it repeatedly to produce the cutting curve. He'd seen enough arrowheads and scrapers in the fields over the years to know what worked stone looked like. He held out his hand. The small one placed the stone into his palm. Then it stepped back, looked at him for a moment, and walked back toward the tree line. Eugene brought the stone inside. He set it on the table under the kitchen light, and we both looked at it for a long time. The workmanship was not sophisticated by the standards of finished indigenous stone tool. There was no fine pressure flaking, no symmetry, but it was functional. The curved edge would scrape hide or cut meat. It was a made thing, made by whatever hands had shaped it, and those hands were young, and those young hands had given it to my husband as a deliberate gift, a trade. We'd been leaving food at the well for 2 years, and now we had received a return gift. I need to tell you what Eugene did after the small one left. He didn't come inside right away. He stood at the gate for a long time in the October dusk, holding the stone, turning it over in his hands the way he turned over a piece of lumber before he cut it, reading the grain. I watched him from the kitchen window. He stood there for at least 10 minutes in the fading light, and when he finally came in, he set the stone on the table under the kitchen light, which is where we looked at everything that required looking at, and he sat down in his chair. And he was quiet for a while in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. He was a man who thought in materials. He had been a carpenter for 20 years at that point, and his vocabulary for understanding the world ran through the physical properties of things. The density of a board, the way a joint would take stress, the difference between a wood that would split along the grain and one that would fight you. He picked up the stone scraper and examined the worked edge the way he examined a saw cut, looking at the angle and the consistency, judging the skill that had gone into it. He ran his thumbnail along the flaked edge. He tilted it under the light to read the percussion marks. Then he said, "This took practice." I asked him what he meant. He said that the flaking on a scraper like this, the controlled removal of material to produce a functional edge, was not something you arrived at the first time you picked up a rock and struck it against another rock. It required an understanding of how the stone would fracture, which meant many attempts, many failures, many pieces of stone that didn't produce what you were trying to produce. He said you could see in the flaking pattern where the maker had shifted the angle of attack to compensate for the stone's grain. He said, "Someone taught it this, or it worked it out on its own over a long time. Either way, it knows what it's doing." I thought about what that meant. A young being in the forest with a piece of Mississippian limestone and the knowledge of how to shape it, knowledge that had to come from somewhere, from instruction or from patient solo experiment, or most likely from both. Knowledge that implied a tradition, a passing down of technique from one individual to another across time, which implied continuity, memory. The specific kind of memory that holds not just experience but method, the knowledge of how to do a thing that can be transmitted to someone who has not done it. Humans call that culture. We use the word so casually that we've largely stopped understanding what it means. It means that what we know extends beyond the span of a single life. It means the dead teach the living through the living's memory of them. It means time bends slightly at the point of transmission, and something that existed before you were born persists inside you and will persist after you are gone. It is not a small thing. It is arguably the central human thing. But the stone scraper on my kitchen table said it was not the exclusively human thing. I held it after Eugene set it down. The edge was sharp enough that I pressed too firmly and drew a line of blood across my thumbnail without meaning to. I held that very carefully after that, aware of it in the way you're aware of something that has teeth. It was warm from Eugene's hands. It was 11 inches of worked limestone that had been carried across our pasture by a being who had learned the making of it, a being who had decided, through whatever process of social reasoning available to it, that the people on the other side of the fence were worth the gift. That was the night I understood that we had moved from observation to relationship, and I understood also that we had not initiated it. We had responded to it, received it, tried to be worthy of it, but the initiation had been theirs from the beginning, all the way back to the morning a young being had decided a 9-year-old boy at a hand pump well was worth the risk of approach. We were not the ones who had reached across. We were the ones who had not flinched when something reached. Eugene turned the stone over in his hands and said quietly, "What do you leave for something like this?" We thought about it for the rest of the evening. The next morning, Eugene went to the equipment shed and came back with a piece of green nylon rope, about 4 feet of it, and tied it into a loose coil. He went to the north pasture gate at dusk and left it on the fence post. 2 mornings later, it was gone. In its place was a piece of dried bark, inner bark of what I later identified as shagbark hickory with a pattern scored into it, parallel lines and crossing marks that I could not decode but that were clearly not random, a message of some kind or a decoration, something made with intent. The exchanges continued through that fall and winter. We left. Rope lengths, a small hand mirror that had lost its frame, a tin cup, a piece of beeswax from the canning supplies, a bundle of dried herbs from the kitchen garden. We received work stones in various stages of completion, bundles of dried plants tied with grass, one of which Eugene's field guide identified as bee balm and another as black cohosh, both of which grow wild in the Monongahela understory, a bird feather that Dale identified as a red-tailed hawk's primary, and on one occasion a wet clump of red clay shaped into a rough, rounded form that might have been representational or might have been the work of practice. The clay form I kept. It sits on the shelf above my desk in the room I use as an office, next to Eugene's carpentry tools that I couldn't bring myself to sell after he died. It is 5 inches across at its widest, dried now and hard, and it is the most precious thing I own. Winter of 93 into 94, the coldest stretch we'd had since the mid-80s. The pastures froze hard enough in January that the cattle could walk on the pond ice without breaking through, which was not what I wanted them doing, but was not what the January of 94 gave me much choice about. Eugene checked the tree line every morning for tracks and found them regularly through the first 2 weeks of January, the same 11-inch prints, the same stride. Then in mid-January he found something different, 3 sets of prints, the 2 he knew, the small ones and the large mother's stride, and a third. This third set was wider than the mother's, with a longer stride, and the depth of impression was notably greater. A heavier individual. Eugene measured the prints at 12.5 inches long and 7 across at the ball. He came home and drew the size on a piece of graph paper, and we both looked at it without speaking for a while. There had been a third one all along, possibly, or the family had grown, or a relative had come in for the winter. We didn't know. We still don't know entirely, because the third set of prints appeared occasionally through that winter and spring, but the individual who made them never came as close to the farm buildings as the mother or the small one did. It stayed in the tree line and at the creek edge, and once Eugene found the prints in a circle around the base of a large hemlock about 30 yards inside the forest, as if a large body had stood there for a long time watching the farm from cover. I thought about the mother's hand on the small one's shoulder in the lower field the summer before. I thought about a family in the forest with whatever social structure a family like that maintained, and I thought that the caution of the third individual, its unwillingness to come as close, its preference for the cover of deep trees, might be the considered opinion of someone who had not yet decided that the people on this farm were worth the risk. And then spring came, and the thing that reordered everything happened, and I have to tell you about it carefully because it is the part that matters most. Dale turned 12 in late April of 94. He was in the 6th grade at Hillsborough Elementary, the last year before middle school, and he'd been playing baseball since March and growing at the rate that boys grow when they suddenly decide to get it over with. He was the same boy who'd walked back from the well with something following him, but 3 years older and 3 years marked by a relationship with something in the forest that most 12-year-old boys would not have had the stillness or the patience or the fundamental decency to maintain. On a Saturday morning in early May, May 7th, I am certain of the date because it was the day after the Greenbrier Valley High School Spring Carnival that Carol had gone to with her friends, which I remember because she came home late and Eugene sat up waiting. On that Saturday morning, I was out front pulling the winter rye off the kitchen garden beds when I heard Dale shout, not a playful shout, not the shout of a boy horsing around or calling to his sister, a sharp, startled shout from the direction of the back pasture. I came around the corner of the house at a run. Eugene heard it too from the equipment shed and was already moving. Dale was standing at the far edge of the back pasture, about 150 yards from the house near the fence line. He was on his feet and he was not hurt, but his hands were up and he was very still. And he was looking at something on the ground in front of the fence. We came up at a walk, both of us reading his body language. As we got closer, I could see what was on the ground. The small one was lying in the grass on our side of the fence, on its side, not curled up the way a sleeping animal curls, but stretched out with one arm extended and its head at an angle that was wrong. It was breathing. I could see the rise and fall of its chest from 20 feet away, but it was not conscious, and it was not moving anything except its chest. Eugene and I stopped about 10 feet away. Dale looked at us and then back at it and said in a very controlled voice that told me he'd already gone through his panic and come out the other side, "I think it's hurt. Its arm is bad." The left arm, extended at an angle that it would not naturally rest in. Not bent, obviously wrong, but held by the weight of the body and the position of landing in a way that suggested something in the arm or the shoulder was not right. There was a thin cut along the outside of the forearm, not deep but visible through the hair. I crouched down. I kept my movements very slow, the way you do with any injured animal. The small one's amber eyes were closed. Its breathing was steady, not labored, which was something. The chest hum sound was present very faintly, even unconscious, which I had noticed before in sleep and which seemed to be something its body produced without direction. Eugene said, "How did it get here?" Dale pointed to the fence. One of the boards had loosened over the winter, a lower board near the ground, and there was a gap wide enough for a smaller body to push through or fall through. He thought it must have come through the gap and then fallen, or fallen while trying to come through. The fence board showed a scuff mark where something had gone over it hard. From the tree line 50 yards north, the clicking trill. Urgent, repeated, the cadence different from anything I'd heard before. I looked up. The mother was at the tree line, standing fully in the open, not using the cover of the tree trunks, not keeping to shadow. In full daylight, broad and tall and plainly visible, and her attention was entirely on the small one lying in the grass. She did not come to it. She stood at the tree line and called, and the small one did not respond, and she called again. I looked at Eugene. He looked at the small one. He said, "We can't just leave it." He was right. We couldn't. Whatever else was true, there was an injured young thing in the grass in front of us, and the mother was at the tree line watching, and doing nothing was not a choice we were capable of making. I went inside for the first aid box. Eugene crouched beside the small one and ran his hands very carefully over the extended arm, feeling along the bone the way he'd learned to do in 30-some years of tending livestock. By the time I came back out, he'd found what he was looking for. There was a break in the radius, the outer bone of the forearm, about 2/3 of the way down from the elbow. Clean break, he thought. No compound fracture, nothing projecting through the skin. The cut on the forearm was separate, likely from the fence board. He said the bone break was not a fresh break. The swelling around it was more than you'd get in an hour or two, which suggested it had happened the day before, possibly longer. The small one had been managing an injury for some time, and in coming through the fence had perhaps used the arm wrong and gone down. "We need to splint it," Eugene said. He looked at me, then at the tree line, then at Dale. "Dale, I need you to hold its head still, not tight, just steady. Can you do that?" Dale said yes. He sat down cross-legged in the grass and put both hands on either side of the small one's head, which was the size of a large cantaloupe, dense and warm. The small one stirred at the touch, but didn't fully come around. Its breathing shifted a little faster, a little harder. The clicking from the tree line intensified. Eugene worked quickly and carefully. He cleaned the cut with antiseptic from the first aid box. The small one flinched hard at this, but did not fully wake, and Dale held steady. and then he fashioned a splint from 2 pieces of board he pulled from his jacket pocket, narrow lath boards he carried for shim work. He padded them with cotton gauze from the box and secured them with bandage tape along the forearm, leaving the wrist free. He did it the same way he'd splinted a calf's leg the previous spring, working with confidence and gentleness. And when he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at the arm and said, "That'll hold." The small one was stirring more fully now, the eyes opening in the unfocused way of something coming up from pain or shock. Its breathing changed, a quicker, sharper rhythm, and it made a sound, not the trill, not the hum, but something shorter and higher, closer to a distress call. Immediately from the tree line came the mother's answer, louder, lower, longer. The small one's eyes focused on Dale's face, which was the first face it registered, then on Eugene, then on me. It was not afraid, which still moves me when I think about it. Injured, disoriented, waking in the middle of a field surrounded by the humans it knew from the fence line and the gift exchanges, and it was not afraid. It looked at each of us in turn and then at its own arm and its expression. And it had an expression, make no mistake, that communicated the way any expressive face communicates, was one of assessment, taking stock. Eugene said quietly, "You're all right. You're all right." He said it the way you say a thing when you're not sure it will be understood, but when the alternative to saying it is silence and silence feels wrong. The small one tried to sit up. Eugene put one hand on its shoulder gently to slow it down. It looked at his hand and then at his face and then sat up slowly on its own without Eugene having to press. It held the splinted arm against its chest. It looked at the splint for a long time, touched it with the fingers of its good hand, feeling the tape and the gauze and the board. Then it looked at the tree line, and from its chest came the hum. Not distress now, not alerting, but the steady, settled version of the sound, the one I'd come to associate with what I can only call contentment. The mother's response from the tree line was immediate. A long, low, resonating call that I felt more than heard, the frequency of it doing something to the air in my chest, and then she moved. She came out of the tree line toward us, not running, not charging, not in any way that read as threat, walking. Crossing the 50 yards of open pasture between the tree line and where we crouched with her child, and every step she took was deliberate and measured and showed no hesitation. I will be honest with you. My body knew fear in that moment, even though my mind was trying hard not to. 7.5 feet of something walking toward me across a field is a physical experience regardless of everything you know about the being standing in front of you. Eugene put his hand on my arm just briefly and I steadied. She stopped about 8 feet away. I have never been so aware of another living being's size in my life. She was enormous in a way that photographs cannot convey, and that I cannot fully translate into words that will carry the reality of it. But the face, the same face I'd seen at the hedgerow in June of '92, in daylight now, close, unobscured, carried the same expression it had carried then. Not aggression, not fear, a focused, deliberate attention. She was looking at the small one's splinted arm, then at Eugene's hands, then at his face, then at the first aid box on the ground. She lowered herself to a crouch. At crouching height, she was still eye level with Eugene. She looked at the small one and made a soft sound, the quietest version of the clicking I'd ever heard, and the small one answered with the low hum and leaned slightly in her direction. Then she looked at Eugene. For a long time, he met her eyes, which took more courage than I think he would ever admit to, and he kept his hands where they were, open and still and low. She reached out one hand and touched the splint. Her fingers were enormous, each one roughly the circumference of a man's thumb, and they moved over the gauze and the board with a delicacy that was startling. She pressed the tape edges lightly. She felt the position of the board against the bone. It was an inspection, methodical and thorough, and when she finished, she made a sound, the low, affirming hum, the same one the small one used, and took her hand back. Eugene exhaled slowly. He said nothing. He just held still. She stood back up to full height and placed her hand on the small one's head, and the small one rose to its feet beside her. It was unsteady on its first step, and she steadied it with one hand. Then she looked at the three of us, me, Eugene, Dale, in that order, and an expression crossed her face that I've been trying to name for 30 years. It was not gratitude in the human sense. I don't think she needed gratitude the way humans need it, as currency in a social transaction. It was quieter than gratitude and acknowledgement, a seeing of what had been done and a recognition of its nature. The way you see someone do something genuinely decent and you simply register it as true. Then she turned and walked her child back across the field toward the trees. The small one moved slowly, favoring the splinted arm, and she stayed close enough that if it had stumbled, she would have had it before it hit the ground. They reached the tree line and moved into the trees, and we watched them go. Dale sat in the grass without moving for a while. Then he said, She knew we helped." Eugene sat down beside him. He looked at his own hands, still holding the roll of bandage tape. He said, "Yeah, she knew." We went inside. We didn't talk much that afternoon. There wasn't much to say that the silence hadn't already said better. Over the following weeks, the small one reappeared at the fence line. The splint was gone by the third time we saw it, and removed or worked loose, but the arm was held differently than before, protected slightly, and it moved the fence line patrol more carefully than it used to. It stayed further from the gap in the fence. The arm healed, based on what we could observe of its movement over the following 2 months, until by midsummer there was no discernible protection or guarding of the limb. The mother came to the field once more that summer in late July. She did not approach the farm buildings. She stood at the hedgerow for about 20 minutes in the late afternoon, and Eugene went out and stood at the far edge of the yard, and they were in each other's line of sight for that whole 20 minutes, and neither of them made a sound or moved. I watched from the porch. It was not an exchange of information. It was a kind of mutual acknowledgement of presence, a checking in. The way neighbors who don't talk much still notice each other across the field. She left first. Eugene came in and sat down and poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly, and then he said, "I think she was just saying it's all right." I think he was right. The fall of '94 brought changes to the farm rhythm and changes to the forest rhythm both. Carol left for Fairmont State in September, which left the house quieter and Dale at the center of the home's attention in a way that he handled with good grace for a 12-year-old. Eugene started doing contract work for a logging operation on a piece of private property over towards Slaty Fork, which kept him away from the farm for 3 days of most weeks through October and November. And the activity along the north tree line shifted. The small one came less often, not gone, but less frequent. The visits shorter. I had the sense, and this is interpretation, not fact, that something in its life was changing, that there was more to occupy it elsewhere, the way adolescence occupies a child and pulls them toward a wider world. By November, the visits were down to perhaps once every 2 weeks, and by the following spring, they were monthly at most. By the summer of '95, when Dale was 13, there were long stretches of silence from the tree line where there had been seasons of activity. The gifts at the fence post continued intermittently. A worked stone, a twisted length of plant fiber cord, a section of honeycomb once, which Dale identified correctly by smell before he touched it. But the regular presence of the small one at the fence line was fading the way all growing things eventually change their habits and their range. Eugene said it once, and said it well. He said, "Kids leave, even the ones who don't have to go very far." Dale did not take it hard. He was old enough by then to understand that the visits had not been permanent, that what had been possible between a 9-year-old boy and a young being from the forest was a function of a particular moment in both of their lives, a window that had opened briefly and was now settling back toward closed. He missed it, I could see that, but he held it the way Eugene and I held it, as something rare and clean and complete in itself. The last gift we received was in October of '95 at the fence post where we'd been leaving and receiving things for 3 years. It was a piece of flat gray shale about the size of a book, and scratched into its surface with something sharp and hard were a series of marks that I have looked at many times in the years since. 3 parallel vertical lines, then a gap, then 2 parallel lines with a horizontal mark through them, then another gap, then 3 marks again. I don't know what it means. I have never known what it means. I have looked at it and turned it in my hands and compared it to nothing I know about written language or symbol systems or anything else that gives me a key. But I know it was left there on purpose, and I know it was the last thing we received, and I know that it was, in some form I cannot fully read, a goodbye. We still have the farm. Eugene is buried in the back field between the walnut tree and the old fence line, which is where he said he wanted to be and where he is. The north tree line is still there. The well is still there, the same hand pump, though the kitchen garden water now comes from a line we ran in 2002. The gap in the fence board was repaired and has been repaired several times since. The tracks in the snow come some winters still, though not close, not the fence line. Further back, deeper in the trees, as if the radius of comfort has moved back to a safe distance now that the particular relationship that had drawn them close is no longer here to draw them close. Dale comes to the farm on Sundays when work allows. He walks the property the way his father used to, checking the fences and the water lines and the outbuildings. And sometimes he walks out to the tree line in the late afternoon and stands there for a while. He doesn't tell me what he's looking for, and I don't ask. I think what he's looking for is not something I can tell him anything useful about. I think he's standing in the place where an impossible thing happened and trying to stay connected to what it felt like, the way you stand in a kitchen where someone you loved used to cook, not expecting them to walk in, but not entirely ready to close that possibility. Carol knows the whole story. She found out the summer after she graduated from Fairmont when she came back to help with the hay and found the journal I'd been keeping, a plain spiral notebook in the desk drawer, and read it. She was 22 years old and she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and asked me if it was all true. I said yes. She thought for a while and then said, "No wonder Dale is so quiet." I said he'd always been quiet. She said, "Different quiet, the quiet of somebody holding something." She was right. He is. We all are. The stone the small one gave Eugene is in the clay dish on the kitchen windowsill. The shale with its 323 marks is on the shelf with the clay form. The notes from Eugene's twine measurements, written in his careful block printing on a piece of graph paper, are in the notebook with the rest of the journal. I am 67 years old. I have been holding this for 30 years, and the only thing that has shifted is the weight of it. It hasn't gotten lighter, but I have gotten better at carrying it. The way you get better at carrying anything you decide is worth the effort. What I believe after 30 years of sitting with what happened on this farm is this: the beings in the forest behind our property were not random. They were not blundering through our land by accident and tolerating our presence with indifference. They made choices, careful, sequential, intelligent choices calibrated across months and years. They decided to allow contact, and they decided the terms of that contact, and when those terms changed, when the small one grew and the need that had drawn it to the fence line shifted, they drew back to the distance that was right for the new arrangement. They were not driven by instinct in the way we use that word to mean unthinking. They were driven by judgment, and their judgment over 3 years and across all the interactions we had was consistently good. I think about the mother crouching in the pasture and examining Eugene's splint on her child's arm. I think about her face at that moment. I think about what it takes for a being with every reason in the world to distrust humans, every reason that history and biology and basic survival logic could provide, to crouch in an open field and let a human man tend her child's injury. I think about what quality of observation produced that level of trust, and I think the answer is the same answer it always is when trust exists, between beings who have no shared language and no shared history and no guarantee that the other party will behave decently. She watched until she saw what we were. Not what we claimed to be, what we actually were in our daily movement across the property, in our voices and our gestures, and the slow, careful way we navigated the edges of her family's life. She watched, and she decided, and she was right. That's all it was. That's all it takes, most of the time, between most kinds of living things. The mountains in Pocahontas County are some of the oldest in the world. The Alleghenies have been worn down to their current height by several 100 million years of weather, and underneath that long, slow wearing down, the ridges and hollows hold what they hold. What they hold includes things that don't announce themselves, things that prefer the distances and the dark trees and the silence of old-growth forest to any version of a world that would require them to be seen. I understand that preference in a way I did not before 1991. I have more sympathy for it now than I ever thought I would. If the small one is still out there, and I believe it is, grown now into something far larger, ranging across territory that goes well beyond the north pasture fence. I hope it remembers this farm the way I remember the looks it used to give Dale across the fence line, with the plain, unguarded recognition of a young thing that found an unexpected safe harbor and made use of it for a while. And I hope whatever family it has now in the deep forest, in the old mountains, is as careful and deliberate and observant as the one it came from. Because the world it lives in is not forgiving of carelessness, and the beings in that world who have lasted this long have done so by being very, very good at knowing who is safe to be around. We were safe. I am proud of that. It is the thing I am most proud of in my life on this farm, above the hay crops and the cattle and the garden, and the 30 years of mortgage payments and all the visible, measurable, documentable things that make up a life. That when something in the forest turned toward us and asked the question that all careful wild things ask when they encounter the human world, what kind of people are these and are they worth the risk? We gave the right answer, not by trying to, just by being what we were. The walnut tree at the edge of the north pasture is showing yellow now, the way it does every October when the light goes long and the nights go cold. I can see it from the kitchen window where I stood 33 years ago and watched my son come across the pasture with the small one behind him. I see it most mornings when I'm washing up after breakfast. It's a good tree, old and solid and still producing. The kind of tree that knows where it is and what it's for and doesn't make a fuss about it. Eugene would have said, that's the kind to be. There is a thing that happens when you carry a secret for long enough. It stops feeling like a secret and starts feeling like a room in the house. You live in all the other rooms. You conduct the visible parts of your life in them, and the door to that particular room stays closed most of the time, not because you are ashamed of what's inside, but because there is no practical reason to open it in the course of an ordinary Tuesday. The room is there. You know what it holds. And on certain evenings when the light is going and the farm is quiet, and you have reached the age where the distance between what you have lived and what you have said out loud begins to feel like a loss, you open the door and stand in it for a while, not to change anything, just to remember. I have been standing in that room a great deal in the past 2 years, since Eugene died and since Dale came home from his last deployment and sat at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, I want to know everything about the summer when I was 9. Not the version you've always told me, all of it." He said it with a steadiness that told me he'd been thinking about asking for a long time, and I poured us both a cup of coffee and I told him everything from the beginning, and then I told him more. The things I'd kept even from him, because there is more. There was always more, and I have always released it in portions, measured it out carefully, given myself time to adjust to the exposure. Dale sat there and listened, and at the end he said, "You should tell all of it." And he is the one who matters most when it comes to this story, the one whose life it belongs to as much as mine. And so I am telling all of it. After the summer of the splint, the summer of '94, things changed in one direction I've already told you, which is the direction of the small ones growing away, the widening radius, the gradual withdrawal to a distance that felt appropriate to whatever the next phase of its life required. But they also changed in a direction I haven't told you about yet, which is the direction of what Eugene found in the forest, the winter of '96. He had gone into the national forest land behind our property to check on a stand of timber he'd noticed showing signs of blight the previous fall. This was not unusual. Eugene knew the forest behind our farm the way he knew the farm itself, walked it regularly, and had a proprietary care for it, even though it wasn't his to own. He went in about a half-mile past the property line along a ridge that carried old-growth red oak and sugar maple above a drainage that fed into Cranberry Creek. He found a structure, not a human structure, not a hunter's blind or a trail crew shelter or anything built with milled wood or hardware store materials. A structure made from fallen timber and living saplings, a dome shaped roughly 15 feet across and 7 feet tall at its highest point, with the uprights bent and woven in a pattern that suggested the maker understood load distribution. The interior was lined with compressed dry grass and sections of bark, and the outer surface was banked with packed leaf litter and moss on the windward side. It was, as shelters go, well built. Not ostentatiously well built. Not the kind of thing that would attract attention from the air or from the road, but functional, insulated, and clearly in current use. He did not go inside. He stood at the opening, which faced south and was sized for something considerably larger than a man, and he looked in, and then he stepped back and walked home. He came in and poured a glass of water and sat down and told me about it in his measured way, and when he finished, we sat with it for a while. The structure was roughly a half-mile from our property line. It was on public land, which meant legally it was trespassing, but the Monongahela National Forest in Pocahontas County is 268 square miles of largely roadless terrain, and the likelihood of any Forest Service ranger finding a structure that deep off-trail was low. What the structure told us was that the family we had been watching at our fence line was not nomadic in the way some people imagine when they imagine a large, wild, unclassified species. They had a place, a constructed, maintained, winter-capable place. There was a rootedness to their presence in these mountains that went well beyond seasonal wandering. Eugene went back the following spring. The structure was still there, still maintained, with fresh material added to the south-facing wall, and a second smaller shelter attached to the north side that had not been there the winter before. He kept going back once a month through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, always alone, always quiet, always going no closer than the opening and standing there a minute and then leaving. He never saw anyone, but the structures were maintained, expanded, added to. By 2000, the original dome had a connected structure on 3 sides with a total footprint he estimated at over 40 feet across, sleeping platforms of layered bark and compressed plant material. What appeared to be food storage raised on bent pole frames, the kind of design that keeps stored food above the flood level and above the reach of smaller scavengers. And throughout the complex there were tools, worked stone tools, the same flaked limestone and chert, and once a piece of black obsidian that had no local source. Obsidian doesn't occur naturally in West Virginia, and the nearest natural deposit is in the Appalachians of Western Virginia. Over 100 miles away, its presence here said something about the range of travel or the network of exchange that existed in the deep forest. Eugene photographed none of this. He had a camera. We had the same point and shoot that everyone in rural West Virginia had in the late 90s. And he could have. He chose not to. He said photographs would become a form of ownership, and he was not interested in owning this. He was interested in knowing it existed and leaving it alone, which is the purest form of respect he knew how to show. I did not tell Dale about the structures until he was an adult, until the conversation at the kitchen table after Eugene died. He listened, and then he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I knew there was more. When I was a kid, I always had the sense there was a whole world back there that I was only seeing the edge of." He paused. The small one when it came to the fence. It wasn't exploring. It knew exactly where it was going. It had been watching us for a long time before it let me see it. I think he's right. I think the attention came before the contact, by months perhaps, by a full season of watching from cover, the family in the forest observing our family on the farm, mapping our routines, assessing our character, deciding whether the risk of proximity was worth the potential benefit of whatever they were seeking. I think the morning at the well was not a chance encounter. I think it was a decision, and the decision had been building for a long time in the mind of a young being in the forest who had decided on its own terms and by its own reasoning that my 9-year-old son was worth the introduction. Dale joined the Army after Hillsborough High School, 2001, 2 weeks after the September 11th attacks. He did 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne and came home different in the way that soldiers come home, carrying a weight that didn't have a name in the vocabulary he'd left with. He's all right. He has been all right for a long time now. But when he sat at my kitchen table after Eugene died and said he wanted the full story, I heard in his voice the particular need of someone who has seen enough of what humans do to each other that the fact of a gentle and improbable presence existing in the mountains of home matters more than it used to. The story worked on him in some way I can't fully characterize. Maybe it was simply the reminder that the world contains more than what you've been made to see in the worst moments of what you've done. He asked me the question I had been asking myself for 30 years. He asked why the small one had come to the fence. What it wanted from him specifically, or from us, I told him what I believed, which was that it was curious and young and drawn to another young thing that posed no threat. And I told him what I didn't know, which was whether there was more to it than curiosity, whether there was something intentional in the contact beyond a young being's need for the particular kind of play and exploration that a peer can provide. He thought for a while and then said a thing I've turned over many times since. He said, "You know how, when you're a kid and you find something you want to show your parents, but you can't bring it inside, so you take them to the window and point? Maybe it was doing that, showing the mother where we were and what we were." I stopped. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The mother was always there, in the tree line, watching. The small one knew we were safe. It had already decided that. Maybe it was showing the mother that we were safe, like it was vouching for us." I've thought about that interpretation for 2 years now, and the more I sit with it, the more it feels right. The sequence of the first summer, the small one following Dale, the mother appearing at the tree line, the incremental advancement of both of them across subsequent months toward the farm buildings and eventually toward us directly. A child vouching for the humans it had visited, a mother observing and deciding to trust the vouching, a family relationship that was doing across the boundary between species exactly what families do across all boundaries, sharing judgment, building consensus, and moving forward together when everyone has decided it's safe. The mother's decision to walk across the field to Eugene and her injured child was not impulsive. It was the end of a multi-year process of deciding. 3 years of watching, 3 years of exchange and observation, and the slow accumulation of evidence that we were what the small one had told her we were through whatever communication passed between them that I will never be able to access. She walked out of the trees that May morning in '94, not because she had no other choice. She walked out because she had decided. In the years since Eugene died, I have spent more time than I used to at the edge of the north pasture at dusk, not waiting for anything, not expecting, just standing where the light goes gold over the tree line and listening to what the forest says in the last hour before dark, the wood thrush in the oaks, the creek sound, the occasional deep note from somewhere in the timber that might be a pileated woodpecker and might not. And on those evenings, I don't try too hard to figure out which. What I have come to believe, and I want to be careful here because belief is not evidence, and I am a 67-year-old woman in Pocahontas County who spent 17 years as a librarian and has a healthy respect for the difference between what can be verified and what cannot, is that the beings in the forest behind our farm are still there. Not the same individuals, or not only the same individuals, but the same family in the larger sense, the same community, the same deep residency in these mountains, the same careful management of their proximity to the human world. They are still making decisions about who is safe and who is not, still calibrating the distance between their world and ours, still moving through the seasons of the Monongahela with an intelligence and a social complexity that I was privileged to observe for 3 years from the particular vantage point of a farm with a 9-year-old boy who moved slowly and looked at beetles. I want to tell you about the summer of 2019. I want to tell you about it because it is the thing that happened most recently, and because it changed the way I understand everything that came before it, and because it involves Dale, and Dale asked me to include it. He came to the farm in early July of 2019 on a Sunday, the way he does most Sundays, and he spent the morning helping me put a new roof on the tool shed, which had been leaking since the previous fall. We worked through the morning and had lunch on the porch, and in the afternoon he said he wanted to walk the north fence line and check the posts, which was honest enough as a reason. Several of the old locust posts had rotted at the ground and needed replacing. I gave him the post hole digger and the bag of quick-set cement and watched him go across the field in the July heat. He was gone about an hour and a half. When he came back, he didn't come directly to the porch. He went to the outdoor spigot on the north wall of the house and ran cold water over his forearms for a long time, which is what he does when he needs a minute to settle himself to come to himself. Then he came to the porch and sat down. He said he'd fixed 4 posts along the fence line and was checking the 5th. near the scrub brush at the edge of the property. When he heard a sound in the brush that he recognized, he said, "The way you recognize a word in a language you studied in school a long time ago." He knew the pattern of it even after 25 years, the clicking trill, lower now and longer in duration than what he remembered from childhood, but structured in the same way. He said he put down the post hole digger and stood still. The brush moved at the property edge, and then it came out, the grown being, upright and unhurried, not the small one as he'd known it. What came out of the brush was tall. He estimated 6'5" to 6'8", with the broad, low center build and the dark hair and the wide face that he recognized as the same lineage, the same physical type. But it was adult or close to adult, and it had none of the compact shape of the being he'd known at 9 years old. It was the small one, grown. He was as certain of this as he could be without any way to prove it, and he said the certainty wasn't based on logic. It was based on the way it looked at him. He said it looked at him the way people look at someone they knew a long time ago in a different life, when you both changed, but the recognition still holds. Not friendly in the immediate, easy way of a familiar acquaintance. More careful than that. More earned. The look of someone deciding how much of the old familiarity still applies after decades have redrawn both of you. He said they stood about 20 feet apart. The grown being made the clicking trill once more, shorter this time, and then the deeper chest hum that he'd heard on the porch all those evenings when he was a boy. He said the chest hum hit him in the sternum the same way it used to, and without planning it, he made a sound back. Not the right sound. He has no capacity to reproduce those frequencies accurately, but some approximation of a low hum, his chest voice, the deepest register he could reach. He said it was embarrassing to describe, which is why he'd never told me before, but he did it, and the grown being's posture changed when he did. Not alarmed, more like the expression you make when a child does something unexpected that pleases you. They stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then the grown being turned and moved back into the brush with the same unhurried deliberateness that Dale remembered from the morning it had walked away from our yard when he was 9. Before it disappeared fully into the brush, it paused and looked back at him. He said the look was brief, not dramatic, not communicating anything he could decode, just the look itself, registering. And then it was gone. Dale came back across the field and ran cold water over his arms and came and sat down, and when he told me all of this, we both cried. Not tragically. Not in the way you cry at funerals or at the end of something that can't be recovered, in the way you cry when a hope you'd given up on. Not consciously given up on, but drifted away from the expectation of, turns out to still be true. I said, "Are you sure it was the same one?" He said, "I'm sure." I believe him. I believe him because the story of this farm and the beings at its edge has always been a story about deliberate choice, about beings on both sides of a significant divide deciding carefully and without hurry to be in proximity to each other. For that grown being to choose to appear at our fence line again in 2019, a quarter century after the last regular contact, when the only person who could have recognized it was standing right there working a fence post. That level of timing does not happen by accident. That is the result of watching, of knowing where we were and what we were doing and choosing the moment. It could have stayed in the brush and let Dale fix his posts in ignorance. It didn't stay. It came out. I have one more thing to tell you, and it is the most recent thing and the reason I am telling this story now. Last fall, October of 2022, I was 74 years old, and I had been having the kind of year you have at that age when you are more alone in the house than you were designed to be, and the farm routines that used to fill the day now sometimes feel like a long project of persistence, not depression, not despair, the quiet weight of someone who has outlived the company she was used to and is learning what the days feel like without it. I was walking the north fence line at dusk, no particular reason, just walking, the way Eugene used to walk it and the way Dale walks it on Sundays. The October light was doing what it does in West Virginia, making the hillside look like a painting of itself, all copper and russet and the particular bronze green of the Monongahela understory in fall. I smelled it first. The earthy, warm, organic density of it on the air, the smell that I have known since 1991 and that I have never been able to mistake for anything else. I stopped walking. The mother was at the tree line. I am not 100% certain it was the same individual I have been calling the mother in this account. There is no way to know with certainty, and 40 years is a long span of time for anyone. But the size was right, and the position was right, and the quality of attention, the focused steadiness of the gaze was exactly what I remembered from the morning in the lower field and the afternoon at the pasture gate. She stood at the trees and looked at me across 50 yards of October pasture. I stood very still. Then I raised one hand, palm out, the way Eugene had raised his hand in the pre-dawn dark when he first saw her at the tree line in the summer of '91. The same gesture, the same intent, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. I am here, I see you, I am not alarmed. She stood for perhaps 3 minutes. The light was going fast the way it does in October when the sun drops behind Droop Mountain. She turned once to look into the forest behind her, and then she turned back and looked at me. And she made a sound, low, sustained, the frequency of it arriving in my chest before it reached my ears, the chest hum that I know as the settling sound the small one made when it was content and still, that I have associated for 30 years with the emotional register that is nearest to peace. She held it for about 4 seconds and then let it fall to quiet. Then she turned and walked into the trees. I did not move for a long time after she went. My feet stayed in the October grass in the cold wet of it, and I stood with my palm still raised from the gesture I had made, the palm out acknowledgement that Eugene had first used 31 years ago in the pre-dawn dark. I lowered my hand slowly. The tree line had closed around her the way it always closed around them, with no evidence of passage, no bent branch or displaced leaf that I could see from where I stood. One moment she was there at the tree edge, massive and present and looking at me with those steady eyes. Then she turned, then she was not there. The evening was settling around the farm the way October evenings do in West Virginia, with a speed that always takes me by surprise even after 40 years of watching it. 1 minute the sky above Droop Mountain is rust and violet, and the cottonwoods at the creek are still visible across the pasture, warm-colored in the last light. Then the light goes. Not slowly, it simply stops the way a conversation stops when someone leaves the room, and what remains is the shape of the day without the warmth of it. I stood in that cooling light and I breathed the air, which still carried the smell. Faint now, trailing the way a scent hangs in a space after its source has moved through. Earth and warmth and that particular organic density that I have never been able to name adequately, because it belongs to nothing else in my experience. I breathed it deliberately, the way you breathe something you know you will not smell again for a long time, holding it a beat longer than normal breath requires. My body was doing several things at once that I was only partially aware of. The hair on my forearms was standing. My pulse was elevated, not from fear, but from the physical reality of having been in proximity to something that large, something that emitted the particular combination of size and heat and presence that activates old circuits in the human nervous system, circuits that predate conscious thought. My legs were tired in a way that had nothing to do with how far I had walked. The tiredness of being very still for an extended period, of holding a posture of careful attention with every muscle locked in place. I thought about the sound she had made, the chest hum held for 4 seconds, the settling sound, the sound the small one had made that morning in May of '94 when it woke from the injury, with Dale's hands on either side of its head, and found that it was not in danger. I had not heard that sound directed at me before, not at me specifically, not with me as the clear recipient of it. She had looked at me, and she had made that sound, and the sound had arrived in my chest the way those sounds always did, as frequency before language, as the body's resonance before the mind's interpretation. I am 67 years old, and I have been a widow for 7 years, and I live alone in the house where I raised my children with a man I loved for 40 years, and I want to be precise about what that sound did to me so that you understand I am not speaking loosely or sentimentally when I say it helped. It arrived, and it settled something. It did not fix anything or resolve anything or fill the space that Eugene's absence had left in the structure of my days. But it settled something in the way that a hand on the shoulder settles something, in the way that being seen by another living intelligence settles something, even across a distance you can't fully measure, and between beings whose inner lives remain and will remain largely opaque to each other. She had seen me standing at the fence line alone in October. She had looked at me across 50 yards of pasture with those steady gold-brown eyes, and whatever she registered in that looking had produced the settling sound. That was not nothing. Across every distance between us, the biological distance, the historical distance, the vast distance of different kinds of knowing, she had done what living beings do when they encounter one of their own kind standing alone in the cold. She had acknowledged it. I stood at the fence line in the cold October dusk, and I thought, she is still here. After 31 years, still on this mountain, still ranging close enough to this farm to be at the tree line on a fall evening, still attending to the lives on the other side of the fence with whatever proportion of attention she gives to the various elements of her world. The gift exchanges had ended. The fence line visits had ended. The proximity had receded to something much larger and more distant, but the attention had not ended. The watching had not ended. The family in the forest had not forgotten this farm or the people on it, and on an October evening when I happened to walk the fence line at dusk, whatever the equivalent of passing by meant for a being that ranges across hundreds of square miles of mountain wilderness, I was acknowledged. I went inside and made dinner, and I sat at the kitchen table alone, and I thought about Eugene and about what he would have said, and what he would have said is almost certainly what I found myself thinking in his voice, which is, good. That's good. I called Dale the next morning and told him. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Mom, you need to tell the story. This is me telling it. There are things about what happened on this farm over those 3 years and in the 30 years since that I am still, after all of it, unable to resolve into certainty. I cannot tell you what species the beings in the forest belong to. I cannot name them in biological terms. I have read over the years, and as a librarian I am comfortable saying I have read comprehensively the scientific literature on unclassified hominids, on the disputed fossil record of late Pleistocene hominids in North America, on the evidence that researchers like Grover Krantz and Jeff Meldrum have accumulated over decades. I have read the counter-arguments, I understand the scientific establishment's position, and I understand why it holds that position. I am not a scientist, and I am not making a scientific claim. I am making an experiential claim. I am telling you what I observed with my own eyes and ears and nose over 3 years of direct interaction and 30 years of peripheral evidence. I observed a family of bipedal, upright, hair-covered hominids of exceptional size and evident intelligence living in the Monongahela National Forest adjacent to our property in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. I observed them make deliberate, sequential decisions about proximity and trust. I observed them exchange material objects with us in a pattern that can only be understood as reciprocal gift exchange, which is a behavior associated in anthropology with social bonding across group boundaries. I observed a mother examine and acknowledge a medical splint applied to her child's injury, and I observed her do this in a manner that indicated she understood what the splint was for. And I observed, 31 years after first contact, what I believe was the same large female acknowledging my presence at the fence line with the sound I associate in her family with peace. I am aware that there are people who will hear all of this and conclude that an elderly widow in rural West Virginia has been living inside a sustained misperception for 3 decades. I understand why they would conclude that. I would probably have concluded the same thing about someone else's account before 1991. I would have been wrong then, and they are wrong now, and the evidence against their conclusion sits on my shelf and in Eugene's handwriting in the spiral notebook in the desk drawer, and in the memory of a grown man who drove in from Greenbrier County every Sunday for years before he finally stood at a fence post and was recognized by something that had known him when he was 9. The mountains of Pocahontas County are among the most biologically diverse in the Central Appalachians. The Monongahela National Forest contains old-growth stands that have never been logged, creek drainages that are rarely visited, ridge systems so steep and heavily timbered that the conventional trails don't attempt them. Cranberry Glades, not 5 miles from this farm as a crow would fly, is a boreal bog that's one of the southernmost of its kind in the eastern United States, a remnant of a Pleistocene climate that persisted in the topographic shadow of the Greenbrier Highlands. The forest here is old, the mountains here are old. The river systems here are among the oldest in the world. The New River and its tributaries predate the Appalachian Mountain chain itself, cutting their beds before the mountains rose around them. This is ancient country, The question of what has lived in it continuously across millennia is not a simple question. I want to say something about how this changed me because I think that's the part of these accounts that matters most and gets talked about least. The events themselves are impossible by any ordinary measure, but the lasting effect of those years, the 3 years of regular contact and the 30 years of awareness that came after, is not the drama of it. It is the humility of it. I have been more careful since 1991, more careful in my judgments, more willing to hold a thing in my hands and look at all sides of it before I decide what it is. Eugene would have said I was always like that, but he was being generous. I was not always like that. I was like everyone is, and willing to decide quickly what the world contained and then move forward with that inventory intact. What happened on this farm required me to stop moving forward with a confident inventory. It required me to stand at a fence line in the early evening and accept that the world contained more than I had been willing to account for, and that this more was not frightening. It was wondrous. The word that gets used too casually about things that are only moderately surprising, but I mean it in its original weight. Full of wonder, demanding of wonder as the only adequate response. The small one watched Dale throw a baseball against the barn wall and crouched and stood and crouched and stood to show him something, because it was young and curious and wanted to share what it was doing with another young being across the fence. The mother walked out into a field and examined a medical splint because her child had been hurt and humans had helped, and she needed to understand what they had done. Eugene stood in the dark with his hand raised palm out to something 7.5 feet tall and waited to see what it would do. And what it did was take a step back and go home, because it had decided that was what the moment required. These are not the behaviors of a mindless animal. They are not the behaviors of anything that does not have a social life rich enough to produce judgment, patience, and care. There is a line from the Psalms. I am Methodist. I grew up Methodist. I still go to the same church Eugene's family attended, that I have thought about more than most of the Bible in the years since 1991. It is from Psalm 104, the long psalm about the natural world, and the line is this: How manifold are thy works, O Lord, in wisdom hast thou made them all. It was written about the earth and what lives in it, and the person who wrote it was not, I think, limiting the scope of what they were praising. They were saying that the world is larger than our ability to catalog it, and that this largeness is a cause for reverence rather than alarm. I have tried to hold that, tried to match the reverence to the largeness, not always successfully. The human impulse to classify and control and explain is powerful, and living beside something that resists all three of those impulses is unsettling in a way that doesn't go away, even after decades. But the unsettlement is the price of contact with something real. Real things resist our explanatory frameworks. That is how you know they are real. Dale is driving over this Sunday. He'll help me take down the storm windows and put up the screen doors, the October switch that Eugene always did and that Dale took over after 2015. We'll have lunch on the porch if it stays warm enough, and in the afternoon he'll probably walk the north fence line the way he does. I'll watch from the porch. The walnut tree will be showing yellow. The tree line will be doing that October thing it does, going from gold to gray in the last hour of light, and somewhere back in those mountains, in the old growth ridges and the creek drainages and the dense quiet places where the Monongahela holds what it has always held, a family will be doing whatever their October requires, laying in stores, moving between the high camps and the low ones as the weather dictates, tending each other through the season, carrying forward one generation to the next the vast accumulated knowledge of how to live in these mountains across every season they bring. That knowledge is older than anything I know, older than this farm, older than the state of West Virginia, older than the name Appalachian, older than the first human being who crossed whatever land bridge or water or shifting continent brought us to this hemisphere. It exists in the forest behind our property in the form of beings who built a dome shelter of bent saplings with insulated walls and maintained it across years, who shaped limestone into scrapers and gave one of those scrapers to a carpenter as a gift, who calibrated a 30-year relationship with a farm family at the pace and terms that were right for them and for us, and who came to the fence line last October to hum a sound of peace at a 67-year-old widow standing alone in the fading light. I do not know what they call themselves. I do not know their full number or their full range or the whole scope of their social structure or the depth of their knowledge of this land. I know what I observed across 3 years and across 30 more. I know that what I observed was intelligent, social, emotionally complex, capable of care and of judgment and of the particular patience that only beings with real memories and real futures can sustain. I know that they chose us, and that they were right to choose us, and that the choosing cost them something and gave us something, and that whatever was exchanged was worth it on both sides. I know that my son stood at a fence post in July of 2019 and hummed back at something that had known him when he was 9 years old, and that something changed in its posture when he did, and that he is a large, quiet, steady man who came home from a war with the particular kind of damage that wars do, and that the thing that helped him most when he came home was not anything institutional or clinical, but the knowledge that these mountains, these specific, ancient, impossible mountains, contained something gentle. I know that Eugene walked a forest half a mile behind our property once a month, for years, to check on a structure he would never photograph and never describe to anyone he didn't fully trust, because the right relationship with something you can't own is one of respectful awareness and deliberate distance. And I know that when I stand at the north fence line in the last light of a fall day, the hair still rises on my forearms. Not from fear, from the same thing it rose from in the summer of '91 when a 9-year-old boy walked back from the well with something following him, and I came out the back door and understood in the first second before I had time for a rational thought that the world was larger than I'd been living in. It still is, it always was. The night before Dale walked back from the well with something following him, I had stood in the north pasture at dusk watching a storm build over Droop Mountain, the clouds coming up over the ridge in the long June light, and the cattle moving to the lower field the way they do when the weather shifts, and the creek sound rising slightly as the barometric pressure dropped, and everything around me had been exactly what I thought it was. Exactly what I had always thought it was. One of those evenings when the farm is exactly itself, every element in its proper place, and the world is fully legible. 24 hours later, it was not. The world had expanded by exactly the distance it takes to walk from a well to a farmhouse in West Virginia in the summer of 1991 with something behind you that moves like a young decision. I'm grateful for that expansion every day that I wake up in this house and look out the kitchen window at the walnut tree and the fence line and the dark shape of the Monongahela timber beyond it. I'm grateful that I was the person standing at that window. I am grateful that my son was the boy at the well and that he moved slowly and looked at beetles and that whatever was watching him from the scrub brush decided he was safe. I am grateful that we were in the assessment of something that had every reason to distrust us, the kind of people worth the risk. That is not a small thing. It may be the thing I am most glad of. It takes work to be that kind of people. It takes the daily decision to move slowly through the world, to observe before you act, to leave room for what you don't yet understand, to treat the edges of what you know with curiosity instead of fear. Eugene did this naturally. I had to practice it. Dale learned it early at a fence line from something that had no obligation to teach him anything at all. Carol learned it secondhand and made it her own. If I could tell you one thing from 33 years of living beside something that should not, by the confident inventory of the modern world, exist, it would be this: the mountain is not finished with you. Whatever the mountain holds, whatever has lived in the old ridges and the creek drainages and the dark timber since before there were names for any of it, is not finished with the human world. It is patient, it is watching, it is making decisions with a care and a deliberateness that puts most human decision-making to shame. And on certain evenings at certain fence lines when the light is going gold over the tree line and you have had the grace to move slowly and keep your hands low and your voice quiet, it will make itself known to you. Not because you deserve it, not because you have earned it by any particular virtue, but because you were there and you were still, and the mountain decided the moment was right. Stand still. Keep your hands low. Learn the difference between the sounds an animal makes and the sounds that something makes when it has decided you are worth the sound. The mountains are full of both. There is something I have not yet said about Eugene, and I want to say it here because it belongs to the fullest version of this story. Eugene Price was a man of deep, practical faith, not the performative kind. He didn't wave religion around or use it as a club or a comfort blanket. He read the Bible the way a carpenter reads a manual for guidance on how things actually work, and he applied what he read in the same quiet, methodical way he applied everything else. He did not think God was far away. He thought God was in the grain of the wood and the set of a fence post and the first frost of October settling on the back field. He was, without ever using the word, a man who moved through life with a reverence for the specific and the concrete, the thing in front of him rather than the abstraction behind it. When the beings in our forest began to make themselves known, Eugene's response was shaped by that sensibility. He did not panic. He did not claim religious significance for what was happening, did not reach for the vocabulary of miracle or visitation or sign. He treated it the way he treated everything novel, as a thing that required patient observation before judgment. He watched, he noted, he measured the tracks with twine and wrote the measurements down. He went back to the forest structure monthly and stood at the opening and observed and left without touching anything. He filed it in the same category as the natural world he'd spent 50 years learning to read, something real, something with its own logic, something that would eventually yield its patterns to whoever was patient enough to wait for them. I don't think he ever fully arrived at a theory about what they were in the scientific or taxonomic sense. I think he held it as a mystery in the old sense of that word, not a puzzle to be solved, but a truth too large for a single explanation, something that required more than one framework to hold. He would have said, if he'd had occasion to say it, that the mystery was the point, that being unwilling to close the mystery prematurely was the only honest position. He died in September of 2015 on a Tuesday, which was his day for the Slatterfork contract work. He came home early because he wasn't feeling right, and I drove him to Greenbrier Valley Medical Center in Lewisburg, and he was there for 4 days before the diagnosis was certain enough that the doctors would say it plainly. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He'd had no symptoms worth noting before that Tuesday. That is how the disease moves sometimes. It keeps its own counsel until there's nothing left to keep. He was home for 3 weeks after the diagnosis because home is where he wanted to be, and there was nothing the hospital could do that was going to change the outcome, and the palliative care team was good and came to the farm, and he was in his own bed, and that was right. Carol came from Lewisburg, and Dale came from Greenbrier County, and my sister, Ruth, came from Tulick, Pennsylvania, and the house was full in the particular way of a house that is both receiving a death and holding a life at the same time. On the second to last night, he died on a Wednesday, so the Tuesday before, I was sitting with him in the bedroom after the others had gone to sleep in the chair I'd moved to the bedside so I could be near him without disturbing his rest. He was awake. Not fully, but present enough to talk in the way you talk in the late hours of a serious illness, when the normal social filters are down and you say what you mean because you have stopped having the energy not to. He said, "The structure in the forest. Do you think they're still using it?" I said I thought so. I said I'd found tracks in the snow the previous January, close to the same area, though I hadn't walked as far back as the structure itself. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I hope they have enough. Going into winter." That was it. That was Eugene. Dying in his own bed in a farmhouse in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, with the October cold coming through the window, and what he was thinking about was whether the family in the forest had sufficient stores for the season ahead. I told him I thought they had enough. I told him the signs I'd seen from the distance I could observe suggested a well-provisioned group. I don't know if this was accurate, but it was what he needed to hear, and it was not a lie in any spirit that mattered, because whatever I could or couldn't observe at the property's edge, what I knew about that family's competence in their own landscape was deep and well established. If anyone had enough, they did. He died the next evening at around 6 o'clock with the light still coming in from the west window. Dale was holding one hand, I was holding the other. He had been unconscious for most of the day, and he went quietly, the way he did most things, no drama, no announcement, just a long breath and then stillness. And then the particular silence of a room that has held someone and now holds the absence of them. I went outside after the hospice nurse had done what she needed to do. I walked to the back porch and stood there in the early dark. The first stars were coming over Droop Mountain, the early October sky going from blue to dark blue to black. At the zenith, the tree line was dark and still. The farm was quiet in the way it goes quiet when something has left it, and from the tree line after a while, the sound, the low, sustained chest hum vocalization that I had been hearing at the edge of my property since the summer of 1991. Not from anywhere specific, not from the fence line, not from the well direction, not from the south hedge row, from the tree line broadly diffuse as if the whole north border of the property was producing it. Held for about 10 seconds and then quieter and then gone. I stood on the back porch and listened until there was nothing more to hear, and then I went inside. I have never told anyone about that moment except Dale. I told him the morning after Eugene's funeral, when everyone else had gone home and we were sitting at the kitchen table with the remains of the funeral food covering every surface. He listened, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, he knew the farm. He walked that fence line his whole life. They knew him. He's right, they knew Eugene the way they knew me, the way they knew Dale, the way you know the people who have lived alongside you year after year and become part of the landscape of your daily life. Not closely, not in the way of intimate friendship, but present, acknowledged, mapped, a carpenter from Pocahontas County who walked the forest on the first Saturday of every month and stood at the opening of a shelter he never entered and then walked home. They would have known his stride and his smell and the sound he made moving through brush, and they would have noted his absence when it came. I believe the sound I heard that October night was not comfort intended for me, though I took comfort from it. I believe it was acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of a community for one of the consistent features of their border landscape, now absent, the way you mark the passing of something that has been reliably present. This is the thing about living a long time near something that operates on a different scale than ordinary human attention. Humans mark time in short units, in seasons and years and decades that feel enormous to us. But 40 years of observation from the tree line is not a long time by every measure. There are trees on Droop Mountain that are 300 years old. There are limestone outcrops in the cranberry glades that have been underwater 3 times over in geological history. Whatever span of time the beings in the Monongahela measure their residency in is likely not the same span that I measure mine in. What feels like a long relationship to me may feel like a recent acquaintance to something that has been ranging these ridges for longer than the farmhouse has been standing. That awareness is humbling in the most useful sense of the word. It reduces me to appropriate size. It puts me where I belong in the actual order of things, which is one link in a very long chain, an inhabitant of a landscape that was inhabiting itself long before I arrived and will go on inhabiting itself long after I'm in the backfield under the walnut tree. This is not depressing, it is orienting. It gives the ordinary days of a farm life a different quality, a quality of participating in something rather than being the thing itself. Eugene understood this. He understood it from his reading and from his years working wood, which teaches you that the material has its own nature and the craftsman's job is to work with that nature rather than against it. He applied the same understanding to everything he encountered, the forest, the farm, the beings at the edge of both. I have been thinking in the 2 years since I started seriously considering telling this story about what I owe the beings it involves. They did not consent to being discussed. They have, from every indication I have over 30 years, preferred to remain unknown to the broader human world. Their management of their proximity to that world, the careful, incremental, calibrated approach, the maintenance of distance when distance is warranted, the strategic withdrawal when observation becomes intrusion, speaks to a deliberate strategy of invisibility that has apparently served them for as long as they have lived alongside human civilization in these mountains. I am breaking a kind of confidence by telling this. I know that. I have wrestled with it. What I arrived at after 2 years of wrestling is this. I am not telling you where they are. I am not telling you how to find the structure in the forest, and I have no intention of doing so. I am not providing photographs or physical samples or any evidence that would allow someone to pin a location to what I'm describing. The Monongahela National Forest in Pocahontas County is 268 square miles. The human instinct to go looking in 268 square miles of heavy wilderness without knowing what you're looking for in country where people go missing every year and need to be searched for with dogs and aircraft is an instinct that will resolve the question for you without my help. Go in by trail, stay on trail, come back safe. What I am telling you is the experience of it and the understanding of it, and what I think it means about the nature of the world we live in and the limitations of what we've been willing to know about it. That seems worth the telling. That seems like something the story is owed in the same way that any long-held truth is owed an occasion to exist in the open. There is a conversation I need to tell you about, one that happened the winter before Eugene died in 2014, when we both knew enough about his health to understand that the following year was likely to be the last full one. We talked more that winter than we had talked in years, the way you talk when you've been given a deadline, when the indefinite future has suddenly become specific and near. We talked about the farm and what would happen to it, about Carol and Dale and whether they'd want to keep it or whether it made more sense to sell. We talked about what our lives had been, what we'd made of them, what we wished had been different. And one night in February, with the snow thick on the pasture and the wood stove ticking in the kitchen, Eugene said out of nowhere, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we'd scared them off that first summer?" I said yes. I'd thought about it many times, he said. If I'd gone out there that morning with a rifle, or if Dale had been different, a louder kid, one of those boys who throws rocks at things just to see what happens, we would never have known. I agreed. He said, most people are never going to know, not because the things aren't there, because most people are the kind of people who go out with a rifle or throw rocks, and the things are smart enough to know the difference. This stayed with me. It is still with me. The proposition that what happened on this farm was not luck or coincidence or the unique occurrence of something rare. It was the result of character, specifically the character of a slow-moving, beetle-watching 9-year-old boy, and the character of two parents who had the sense and the decency to treat an unknown presence at their property line with curiosity rather than alarm. The beings in the forest made a calculation, and the calculation involved reading the people on the farm and the people on the farm. That particular year on that particular fence line happened to be the right kind. Other families have lived adjacent to this forest. Other children have walked to that well. The farm before ours, the one that belonged to Eugene's parents and his grandparents before them, was occupied by Prices for 3 generations, going back to the 1880s. We don't know what they observed or didn't observe at the north tree line. We don't know what came close and then pulled back because the conditions weren't right. We don't know how many families in Pocahontas County and the 4 surrounding counties in the long run of the Appalachians from northern Georgia to southern Pennsylvania have had their own version of a morning at a well or an encounter at a fence line, and how many of those versions ended at the first threshold because someone reached for a rifle or raised a voice or moved fast in the way that collapses the distance before either party is ready. I suspect the answer is many. I suspect the contact is more common than the recorded encounters would suggest, and the recorded encounters are more common than the public discussion of them would suggest, and the public discussion is more common than the institutional acknowledgement of them would suggest. And all of this is a set of concentric rings around a truth that is being kept invisible by the particular human combination of embarrassment and authority that keeps inconvenient realities at bay. What I am doing by telling this story is putting it into the record. My record, my account, one farm, one family, 30 years. That is not enough to change the institutional picture, and I am not naive enough to think it will, but it is enough to exist, to be one voice among the many that have said it is real, I was there, I will not pretend otherwise. Dale asked me once, I think he was in his late 20s, maybe 2 years after he came back from the second deployment, still in the adjustment years. He asked me if I was ever afraid, not in the moment of a specific encounter, but afraid in the larger sense. Afraid of what it meant, afraid of the implications, afraid of living alongside something that operated outside the categories of the known world. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, only at the beginning, only in the first weeks before the exchanges started and the visits became regular and the presence settled into something predictable. After that, no. Not afraid, sometimes awed in the way that can resemble fear from a distance, but it was not fear. Fear is what you feel when something threatens you. This was never a threat. It was an invitation, framed in the only language available, presence, proximity, the slow demonstration that the distance between us could be managed safely. An invitation to know more than the world had been willing to let us know. No, I accepted that invitation. I am glad I did. I am glad Eugene did. I am glad Dale was who he was. At the well, slow-moving and gentle-faced and looking at beetles, the exact kind of child who looks at a new thing and opens his hands instead of closing them into fists. The farm will go to Dale when I'm done with it. He has said he wants it. He's said he doesn't want to farm it seriously, that it's too much for one person without Eugene running the operations, but that he'll keep the cattle going at a reduced scale and use the rest of the land for what it's good for, which is being here in Pocahontas County, at the base of the mountains that have held this family for 4 generations, and at the edge of the forest that held something else for much, much longer. I told him when we had the conversation about the farm's future that the fence line was his inheritance too. That the relationships we'd built, if you can call them that, and I think you can, I think relationship is the right word for what develops when 2 groups of beings share a border for 30 years and manage that border with care, were his to carry forward. He nodded in his steady way and said he understood, and I believe he does. Because the morning will come, maybe this winter, maybe 10 years from now, when he is walking the north fence line at the right hour, and the air will carry that particular smell, earth, and warmth, and something organic that doesn't belong to any cataloged animal in the state of West Virginia, and he will stand still the way his father taught him and hold his hands low and wait. And whatever the forest decides to make of that stillness will be its own decision, made in its own time, on its own terms. That is how it has always worked. That is the only way it can work. You make yourself available. You demonstrate over and across as much time as is needed that you are the kind of people worth the risk, and then you wait. And if you are patient and lucky and decent, the forest decides. We got to be the people the forest decided about, all 4 of us. Eugene and Dorothy Price, Carol Price before she was Carol Alderman, Dale Price before he was Sergeant Dale Price, and again after. One family on 112 acres on the eastern slope of Droop Mountain, bordered by Cranberry Creek and the old-growth timber of the Monongahela. One ordinary family in an ordinary place who turned out to be the right kind of people at the right moment and spent 30 years being changed by what that meant. I am 67 years old. The walnut tree is showing yellow. The mountains are where they have always been. The world is larger than they are letting you believe. It always was. I want to go back to the exchange at the fence post for a moment because I didn't give it its full due in the earlier telling, and it deserves more than I gave it. The exchanges, what we left, what we received, lasted from the fall of '93 to October of '95. 2 years of deliberate reciprocal giving across a property line between parties who shared no language and no prior relationship beyond months of careful observation. I want to say something about what it was like to be on our side of that, because it is easy in the telling to make it sound tidy and sequential, a gift for a gift, an item for an item, a clean anthropological diagram. It was not tidy. It was emotionally overwhelming in a way I could not have predicted and still find difficult to describe. The first morning after we'd left the twists of green nylon rope and went back to find them gone, on the fence post, in their place, the tight bundle of shagbark, hickory, inner bark with the scored marks, I stood at that fence post for a long time. I held the bark in both hands and I turned it over and I looked at the marks, the parallel lines and the crossings, and I understood that I was holding something made by hands that were not human hands for a mind that was not a human mind, and that the making of it had involved decision and intention and the application of a technique learned from someone or worked out over practice. It was not a pebble dropped on a post. It was a thing made and then placed for us specifically in the language that had developed between us. I am a librarian. I have spent my career with objects that carry meaning, with the technology of encoding thought into material form and transmitting it across time and distance. I understood what I was holding in that sense, and the understanding hit me with a force that I was not prepared for. Someone had made something and left it for me. Someone who existed entirely outside the human world of making and leaving things had nonetheless participated in that world, had recognized it as a form of communication available to both of us, and had used it. The scored marks on the bark may or may not have been representational. I was never able to decode them, and I tried for a long time. But the act of making them and placing them was representational in itself. It represented regard. It represented the recognition that the beings on the other side of the fence were beings worth making things for. I sat down in the grass by the fence post and I cried, not from sadness, from the particular overwhelm that comes when the world does something generous you didn't know to hope for. Eugene found me there. He came looking when I didn't come back in, and he crouched beside me and looked at the bark in my hands and understood. He didn't say anything. He sat down in the grass next to me and put his arm around my shoulders, and we stayed there until I was ready to go back to the house. That is the kind of man he was. He understood that some moments don't require anything except being present in them together. We kept every item we received from the fence post in a canvas bag in the bottom of the desk drawer until we got the fireproof safe after Carol left for college, and we felt safer keeping them there. 17 items over 2 years, not counting the clay form and the shale with the marks, which I keep separately on the shelf. I could list every one of them, and someday, maybe I will, in a more thorough account than this. The worked stones in various stages, the plant bundles, the honeycomb which we ate, it would have been wrong not to, the bird feather, the bundled dried herbs, each one chosen and placed with a care that was evident in the choosing and the placing, in the consistent pattern of response to what we'd left that showed attention and assessment. When we left something sweet, the return was sweet. When we left something functional, the return was functional. When we left the tin cup, which I chose because it was a container, because I thought a container might be useful in a forest life, and the return was the obsidian blade, which is a tool, which is what a container is in the broadest sense. The dialogue in that exchange was not sophisticated by the standards of human gift-giving between parties who share a language and a culture, but it was a dialogue. Two groups of beings learning each other's vocabulary for exchange from the inside of the exchange itself. After the exchanges stopped, after the shale with its 323 marks in October of '95, I kept leaving things at the fence post for another season. Not because I expected reciprocation, but because stopping felt wrong. Stopping felt like the withdrawal of something that had been offered. We had committed by the act of beginning to a relationship of regard, and unilateral withdrawal from that felt like a failure of integrity. So through the winter of '95 and into the spring of '96, I left things, small things. Dried apple slices, a handful of shelled walnuts, a piece of candle. Nothing was returned, but things were taken. Every item was gone in the morning, through that winter and that spring, which told me that the taking was still happening even if the giving had stopped. The relationship had changed shape, but not ended. By the summer of '96, I stopped leaving things too. Not because I decided to exactly, more because the natural rhythm of the farm, with Carol leaving for Fairmont State and Eugene taking on the Slatterford contract work and Dale going from middle school to high school, and all the daily requirements of that shift gradually filled the time that the fence post visits had occupied. Life accelerated the way it does when children enter adolescence, and the household changes around that change, and the careful, slow attention we had given to the north edge of the property receded into the background of a busier season. I do not think this was wrong. I think it was appropriate. The contact had occurred, the relationship had been established, and both parties had drawn back to a sustainable distance. The family in the forest had other things to tend to as well. The small one was growing, was presumably moving through its own adolescent expansion of range and activity, was less dependent on whatever the fence line visits had provided. The rhythm of exchange had served its purpose and completed its arc. And when it completed, both parties let it complete. That is how healthy relationships of any kind close a phase, not with drama or declaration, but with a natural trailing off, a withdrawal to appropriate distance, a settling back into the respective lives that were always larger than the relationship itself. This is what I mean when I say that everything about the way the beings in the forest handled their relationship with us was calibrated. Not just the approach, but the withdrawal. Not just the advancement of trust, but the management of its limits. They were not seeking adoption into our world. They were not seeking permanent integration or sustained dependency. They were seeking something specific, and perhaps the particular quality of contact that the small one had found in Dale, perhaps a form of social curiosity that the deep forest, vast as it is, cannot entirely satisfy. And when they had found enough of it, or when the season of that need had passed, they receded, gracefully and fully and without damage to anything they built. That capacity for graceful withdrawal is, I think, as instructive as anything else about them. It speaks to a social intelligence that understands limits and honors them. You cannot manage the kind of long-term, low-level, multi-generational proximity to the human world that these beings have apparently maintained across centuries, across the entire history of European settlement in the Appalachians, without a very precise understanding of what proximity costs and what it yields, and where the line is between productive contact and dangerous exposure. They walk that line with a precision that I find, even now, astonishing. We walked it, too, for our part, not with their precision or their experience, but with an earnestness and a care that was apparently sufficient. We were not experts. We were a family with a farm and a fence line and a set of values that we'd arrived at through ordinary living. And be decent to things, move slowly, don't break what you don't have to break, pay attention. Those values were enough. They turned out to be enough. And I will carry the knowledge of that for whatever years I have left at this farm, beside this fence line, under these mountains that are older than anything else I know.